So I'll start off by saying that, so the goal of our research was based on, the finding in a lot of the study abroad research showing that fluency is one area where we find a lot of gains. And this has been shown time and time again versus, other areas of language where we don't find such positive impacts of study abroad. But in fluency is the one area where we do find it. It's very nice to see you here too, yes. We've appreciated reading your study. But what happens to that fluency once they return home? And knowing about this, we believe, can contribute to our understanding of foreign language attrition and variables that influence it. So you might be quite aware that there's a lot of research on first language attrition. Yeah, many of you might be interested from your own perspective. But we started thinking about this, and we found that there's very little on foreign language attrition. So what happens, right, once you make those gains in your foreign language, particularly after study abroad, when so many of us get to such a high advanced level, what happens to that fluency gain, those fluency gains that we've made? In the foreign language, or in the language attrition research, you'll often see Paradis' name there, and this idea of the activation threshold hypothesis, and the idea that frequency and recency of use matter a whole lot, right? So the lack of use is a source of attrition because the threshold of activation increases over time, right? So that, I think that makes sense in a lot of ways. If you're not using it, it takes your brain more effort, right, to find those words, for example, than if you are keeping up with it. However, Nasser claimed a general critical threshold for proficiency after which language is less vulnerable to attrition. So if your proficiency gets so high, then it's going to be harder for you to lose it over time. And we think this is particularly relevant for study abroad students, right? And the idea of, does it matter how high that they get, how proficient they become, and how quickly they lose the language or not? So there are a lot of gaps in the literature in this area. There's very little research on the long-term evolution of foreign language proficiency post-study abroad. And most studies are based on self-report data, like how would you report your proficiency. We were able to find one really cool PhD dissertation coming out of the Netherlands. This is one of Monica Schmid's, she was one of her students. And she did a cross-sectional and longitudinal, she had both sets of data that were collected twice over a one-year period with 5 participants. So she had Dutch and German-speaking university students who were studying abroad in Spain, and she collected data, like it really depended on the participant, how long, how many months after they had been abroad. So she didn't have a large group of participants, but the results of her longitudinal data demonstrated that the participants were or had experienced attrition, particularly in their reduced accessibility to lexical items. And I think that would be one area that we assumed would happen. And she had a variety of measures, including a sociolinguistic interview, a C-test, and a picture naming test. And results of the cross-sectional data demonstrated that initial proficiency was a significant predictor of language retention. Okay, so how much they were able to keep or not lose, the other side of that. But there's been little support found for the role of attitude and motivation, disuse, language contact, or length of exposure during study abroad, or during post-study abroad and the instructional period. So there's so many ways we could go with this research if we continued to look at students after they come back from study abroad and what happens to their language abilities and what, individual differences, contextual differences, all of these things and how they influence their degree of maintenance or attrition or development even. Like we were starting off this project thinking we're going to look at attrition, and then Roz Mitchell, who's part of the LangSnap group, said, why are you only looking at attrition, right? Some of these students, they have partners that they met abroad that they're still in contact with. So some of the people you're going to see development, likely. Some of them are teachers now in the professional world, so you're going to see potential development. So we were like, yeah, so we changed sort of our mindset about that. But there's still, we thought most were probably going to be experiencing some type of attrition. Okay, so we're using the data from the LangSnap project, and actually it fits really well for a study of attrition because we have them at the point that they were the best, right? Which Bardovi-Harlig and Stringer called the point. I'm missing the word now. Thank you. Their peak attainment. Thank you. So when they were at their very best, because then you can sort of track, right, as they start to lose or maintain or whatever. So we thought that this would be a perfect sort of follow-up study based on the data that we had. So we originally for that project had 56 students who were required to spend their junior year abroad. And as I presented last night, we tracked them 6 times over approximately 2 years. This 7th round of data was collected last summer. So it was 4 years after they returned from study abroad and 3 years after they had graduated from university. And for the follow-up study, we got 31 participants. So it's about 56% of the total. And the way that we were able to get these students, we didn't think about this when we were doing the original project, but we had created a Facebook group. Not that we followed them on Facebook, but we created this group during the original project so that we could communicate with them. Like, hey, it's time for us to come visit you, you know, can we set up a time? And that group was instrumental for us getting contact with them for this next follow-up project. Because then we just posted something in that group that was like, hey, who wants to participate? A few people we had to track down on LinkedIn, but it wasn't very hard. So like such a benefit now too of the internet, right, that we are able to find where these participants were. So this is our research question. So what extent does the fluency of L2 Spanish and French learners change 8 months and 4 years after residence abroad? And to what extent can post-study abroad language exposure and peak fluency attainment explain the utterance fluency of changes, right, of learners 8 months and 4 years after residence abroad? So we're looking at their change scores. So here's the participant group that we've ended up with. About half of our original Spanish group and a little bit more than half of our French group. The mean age when they started in the project and the years of studying when they started in the project, the LangSnap project. So the data for this study come from the speaking task. The oral narrative that we gave them was a picture-based narrative where they saw prompts and then they got to look at the pictures and then they would retell the story looking also at the pictures, right? So they always had the pictures while they were retelling it. And it was the same exact task for the French and for the Spanish participants. So for this presentation, we're just looking at when they did the pre-test. So this was the cat story you just saw. In Sojourn 3, which was the end of their stay. And then the second time that we collected data in the UK during their final year of university. Okay, so this one was 8 months after, and then this one was the most recent one, right? So 4 years after study abroad. Where? Oh, yeah, thank you. So here, a lot of them we got in the UK. They were living there, but a few of them were living in other countries. So when we could, we were able to visit them. And then the ones that we couldn't visit, we did all of our data collection over Skype, which proved to be not so bad. So the narratives were transcribed in CLAN following chat conventions, like in our previous research. And the fluency variable that we're looking at for this presentation is speech rate, which is the total syllables divided by speaking time. And this speaking time includes pauses. And we used Pratt to identify and measure the pauses. And we decided to just focus on speech rate. We have an article coming out in Modern Language Journal where we compared a few different fluency measures, and we found that speech rate is actually a pretty good overall general measure of fluency. We can get more specific looking at pauses and articulation rate, but we thought for general kind of understanding of fluency development that this is a pretty good measure, right? Yeah. Anything else to say? So because language exposure after graduation was so important to us, we had to find a way to operationalize that. So we came up with just a coding scheme looking at whether people had intense interaction, thank you, or exposure after graduation from the university, or what we called limited exposure, depending on the consistency and intensity of their L2 contact. So in making those decisions, we used data from a questionnaire on language contact, which we adapted from some of Monica Schmid's work for L1 attrition that she made publicly available on her website, which I always love people who make their stuff. That's why I keep saying Iris, and people who do that stuff is great. So we had an L2 interview and an L1 interview as well. So we looked at that data, all three, to make our decision about whether they were intense or limited with their exposure. And we started off with more categories, and then I think we ended up deciding on those two. So just to give an example, some of our high exposure participants were currently living abroad in a target speaking environment. Like this participant, and sorry that they're numbered, but we had 56 originally. That was kind of the easiest way to go about it. So participant 152, she's currently living in Barcelona. She had done her year abroad in Spain, and she went back after she did a master's degree in Barcelona as well, and is still living there and working. Participant 180 was in Spain for her year abroad too. She was really interesting in that she was in Pamplona, and she was a teaching assistant, but she ended up teaching in a school that was English Basque bilingual. So when she went to school, she never heard English or Spanish, and then at home in Pamplona, she lived with all English speakers. So she had a very challenging experience for her, and she never really found a way to get that Spanish-speaking environment that she wanted. So I found it really interesting when we caught up with her, and she was living in Madrid, right? So she went back, she found a way to have that experience that she was hoping for. So she was there when we collected the data. And then participant 107 did her year abroad. Was she in Paris? She was in, somewhere in France, and she was back living in Paris. So we have these ones that we classified as high exposure. We also had people that we classified as high exposure who had recent overseas experiences. So after they graduated, for example, 166, who had done her year abroad in Spain, after graduation, she went and taught English in Mexico for a year. And she had lots of Mexican friends, and she now has a Mexican boyfriend in the UK. So she, we definitely, even though currently she wasn't living there, she's had lots of high exposure since graduation. Then we had a good number of them who had very limited exposure, who were currently working in the UK. They hadn't left. They'd only maybe gone to France or Spain on holiday, and their job requires little to no L2. Okay, so here are the results. The blue is their pre-sojourn. So this is separated by the two L2 groups. And what you see right away is by the end of their stay abroad, they made huge gains in fluency, as we kind of expect, right? After, oops, did I do that? Okay, well, then we can leave it. That's fine. You can see that it dipped down a bit, yeah? And then look at here. This made us so excited. That's the most recent round of data collection. So when we ran our statistical tests, we ended up combining both groups because they were really similar. Oh, well, sorry, I didn't say this first. But there was, when we looked statistically, there was a significant main effect for time, which means over time they changed. But no main effect for group, nor an interaction, which just means that the two groups changed over time in the same way. Okay, no major differences there. So when we ran the post hoc comparisons, we found that there were significant differences between the pretest and all other rounds, right? So that made us happy. They never went back down to the pretest level. And then comparing between these, so there was a significant difference here. So this like sort of immediate, we can say immediate, but 8 months after study abroad, they, as a group, showed a decline. But now there's not a significant difference between the end of their year abroad and 4 years later, which made us really excited. thank you, to see that. So we wanted to test whether any of the variables that we were interested in could explain the gains, or to what extent they could explain the gains or the losses or the maintenance or whatever. Because our sample size is so small, we could only use 2 variables. So the 2 variables we decided to use for our regression were peak attainment, so what was their level of fluency at the end of their stay abroad, and then our language exposure variable, which we dummy coded, 0, 1. So you can see these are the numbers that we ended up with, 19 who had limited exposure and 12 who had intense exposure. So this is the result of the regression. It was significant, and it explained 40% of the variance, these 2 variables, their peak attainment and the exposure. Both were significant in the model, and you can see the p-values for those 2 variables. So this is just a graph kind of showing visually. The blue are the people who were limited exposure, and the red are the intense exposure. And down here, this is their peak fluency rate in Sojourn 3, so at the end of their stay abroad, and over here is the change. Okay, so we can see some patterns there between the colors, yeah? Here's some graphs of the individuals, so you can kind of get a sense of what they look like, the limited exposure group. You can see there was a lot more variation, even in Sojourn 3 here, and this is something we're curious about. What is it about? Maybe there's something about them in particular, even at the end of their stay abroad. That looks a little bit different, right, than here. The lowest person is way up here, 2 1/4 or something, and the lowest person here is 1 3/4, yeah. So something that we need to look at in more detail. I'm going to skip that for a minute. So overall, the 2 groups showed an early decrease in speech rate, thanks after 8 months back in the home country. Remember, it was statistically significant, but it wasn't that much. And it was nowhere near like going back to lower levels like at the pretest. But 3 years later, there was no difference between their in-Sojourn 3 and their post-Sojourn 3 speech rate. And some of the participants' speech rate increased from post-Sojourn 2 to post-Sojourn 3. And that's particularly interesting, like what was their experience, that they got even better, right, than after they came back from study abroad. And changes in their fluency is particularly accounted for, or is partially accounted for by language exposure and peak speech rate attainment in Sojourn 3. We would like to add more variables to our regression, but we don't have enough participants to warrant that. But we can look at it, look at them individually, and that's something we want to do in the long term. So we had some individuals in both groups who were outliers, and we need to look into them more. One student who was classified as limited was way off the charts, so much higher than everyone else, and so we want to figure out, what makes him special. But in general, the participants have maintained their gains 4 years after study abroad and 3 years after graduating. And even some participants with limited exposure maintain their gains as well. What's interesting, I think, is previous research on attrition has shown that productive skills are lost quicker than receptive skills. But here we see evidence that productive skills are maintained 4 years later. So we'll have to see. And there hasn't been a lot of research on fluency, at least within the foreign language attrition literature. So it might be that no one's really looked at it. So some limitations. We have interaction data from, interview data. So we want to look at that too and see if we find similar results. We're still unsure about our operationalization of language exposure. And we want to look at other aspects of utterance fluency as well, like breakdown fluency when they pause, if they repair, those kinds of things. We eventually will look at accuracy and complexity, and we are interested in other variables like motivation, right? That might influence the degree to which they gain or lose or stay the same. So that's it. Thank you.